Dearly Devoted Dexter. Chapter 5. Given enough time, I am sure I could come up with an entire list of more unpleasant things than having Sergeant Dokes turn into my own personal shadow. But as I stood here in my high-fashion foul-weather gear and thought of Riker and his red boots slipping away from me, it seemed bad enough, and I was not inspired to think of anything worse. I simply climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove through the rain to my apartment. Ordinarily, the homicidal antics of other drivers would have comforted me, made me feel right at home, but for some reason, the maroon Taurus following so close behind took away the glow. I knew Sergeant Dokes well enough to know that this was not simply a rainy day whim on his part. If he was watching me, he would keep watching me until he caught me doing something naughty, or until he was unable to watch me anymore. Naturally enough, I could readily think of a few intriguing ways to make sure he lost interest. But they were all so permanent, and while I did not actually have a conscience, I did have a very clear set of rules, and that worked somewhat the same way. I had known that sooner or later Sergeant Dokes would do something or other to discourage my hobby, and I had thought long and hard about what to do when he did. The best I had come up with was, alas, wait and see. Excuse me, you might say, and you have every right. Can we truly ignore the obvious answer here? After all, Dokes might be strong and lethal, but the Dark Passenger was so much, much more, and no one could stand against him when he took the wheel. Perhaps just this once? No, he said, in the small, soft voice in my ear. Hello, Harry. Why not? And as I asked, I thought back to the time he had told me. There are rules, Dexter, Harry had said. Rules, Dad? It was my 16th birthday. There was never much of a party since I had not learned yet to be wonderful and charming and chummy, and if I was not avoiding my drooling contemporaries, then they were generally avoiding me. I lived my adolescence like a sheepdog moving through a flock of dirty, very stupid sheep. Since then, I had learned a great deal. For example, I was not that far off at 16. People really are hopeless, but it just doesn't let on. So, my 16th birthday was a rather restrained affair. Doris, my foster mom, had recently died of cancer, but my foster sister, Deborah, made me a cake, and Harry gave me a new fishing rod. I blew out the candles, we ate the cake, and Harry took me to the backyard of our modest Coconut Grove house. He sat at the redwood picnic table that he had built by the brick barbecue, and often he sat at the redwood picnic table that he had built by the brick barbecue oven and motioned me to sit too. Well, Dex, he said, 16. You're almost a man. I wasn't sure of what that was supposed to mean. Me? A man? As in a human? I did not know what sort of response was expected of me, but I did know it was usually best to not make clever remarks with Harry, so I just nodded. And Harry gave me a blue-eyed x-ray. Are you interested in girls at all? He asked me. In what way? I said. Kissing, making out, sex. My head whirled at the thought as though a cold, dark foot were kicking at the inside of my forehead. Not, no. I, I said, silver-tongued then. Not like that. Harry nodded, as if that made sense. Not boys, though, he said, and I just shook my head. Harry looked at the table, then back at the house. When I turned 16, my father took me to a whore. He shook his head and a very small smile flickered across his face. It took me 10 years to get over that. I could think of absolutely nothing to say to that. The idea of sex was completely alien to me, and to think of paying for it, especially for your child, and when that child was Harry, well, really, it was all too much. I looked at Harry with something close to panic, and he smiled. No, said Harry. I wasn't going to offer. I expect you'll get more use out of the fishing rod. He shook his head slowly and looked away, far over the picnic table across the yard down the street. Or a fillet knife? Yes, I said, trying not to sound too eager. No, he said again. We both know what you want, but you're not ready. Since the first time Harry had talked to me about what I was on a memorable camping trip a couple of years ago, we had been getting me ready. Getting me, in Harry's words, squared away. As a mutton-headed young artificial human, I was eager to get started on my happy career, but Harry held me back because Harry always knew. I can be careful, I said. But not perfect, he said. There are rules, Dexter. There have to be. That's what separates you from the other ones. Blend in, I said. Clean up. Don't take chances. Harry shook his head. More important, you have to be sure before you start this that the person really deserves it. I can't tell you the number of times I knew somebody was guilty and I had to let them go. To have the bastard look at you and smirk and you know he knows. But you have to hold the door for him and let him go. He clenched his jaw and tapped his fist on the picnic table. You won't have to, but you have to be sure. Dead sure, Dexter. And even if you're absolutely positive. He held his hand up in the air, palm facing me. Get some proof. It doesn't have to hold up in court, thank God. He gave a small and bitter laugh. You never get anywhere, but you need proof. Dexter, that's the most important thing. He tapped the table with his knuckle. You have to have proof. And even then, he stopped. An uncharacteristic Harry pause. And I waited knowing something difficult was coming. Sometimes, even though you let them go, no matter how much they deserve it, if they're too conspicuous, for example, if it would raise too much attention, let it go. Well, there it was, as always. Harry had the answer for me. Whenever I was unsure, I could always hear Harry whispering in my ear. I was sure, but I had no proof that Dokes was anything but a very angry and suspicious cop. But chopping up a cop was certainly the sort of thing the city got indignant about. After the recent untimely demise of Detective LaGuardia, the police hierarchy would certainly almost be a little sensitive about a second cop going out the same way. No matter how necessary it seemed, Dokes was out of bounds for me. I could look out the window at the maroon Taurus nosed under a tree, but I could do nothing about it except for wish some other solution to spontaneously arise. For example, a piano falling on his head. Sadly enough, I was left hoping for luck. But there was no luck tonight for poor, disappointed Dexter. And lately, there had been a tragic lack in falling pianos in the Miami area. So there I was in my little hovel, pacing the floor with frustration, and every time I peeked out the window there was the Taurus parked across the way. The memory of what I had been so happily contemplating only an hour ago pounded in my head. Can Dexter come out and play? Alas, no. Dear Dark Passenger, Dexter is in timeout. There was, however, one constructive thing I could do, even cooped up inside my apartment. I took the crumpled piece of paper from McGregor's boat out of my pocket and smoothed it out, which left my fingers sticky from the leftover gunk of the roll of duct tape to which the paper had been stuck. Riker, and a phone number. More than enough just to feed one of those reverse directories I could access from my computer, and in just a few minutes I had done so. The number belonged to a cell phone, which was registered to a Mr. Steve Riker of Tiger Trail Avenue in Coconut Grove. A little bit of cross-checking revealed that Mr. Riker was a personal photographer, of course. It could have been a coincidence. I'm sure that there are many people named Riker around the world who are photographers. I looked at the yellow pages and found that this particular Riker had a specialty. He had a quarter page that said, "Remember them now, remember them as they now are." Whoa, sorry. He had a quarter page ad that said, "Oh my God." He had a quarter page ad that said, "Remember them as they are now." Riker specialized in children. The coincidence theory might have to go. The Dark Passenger stirred and gave me a small chuckle of anticipation, and I found myself planning a trip over to Tiger Trail for a quick look around. In fact, it wasn't terribly far away. I could drive over now and let Sergeant Dokes follow along playing pin the tail on the Dexter. Splendid idea, old chum. That would save Dokes a huge deal of boring investigative work when Riker finally disappeared someday. He could cut through all the dull routine and just come and get me. And at this rate, when would Riker appear? It was terribly frustrating to have a worthwhile goal in sight and yet be held in check like this. But after several hours, Dokes was still parked across the street, and I was still here. What to do? On the plus side, it seemed obvious that Dokes had not seen enough to take any action beyond following me. But leading the way in the very large minus column, if he continued to follow me, I would be forced to stay in character as the mild-mannered forensic lab rat, carefully avoiding anything more lethal than just one rush per hour on the Palmetto Expressway. That would never do. I felt a certain pressure, not just the passenger, but from the clock. Before too much time passed, I needed to find some proof that Riker was the photographer who took McGregor's pictures, and if he was, have a sharp and pointed chat with him. If he realized McGregor had gone all the way of all flesh, he would most likely run for the hills. And if my associate at the police headquarters realized it, things could get very uncomfortable for dashing Dexter. But Dokes had apparently settled in for a long stay, and the moment was there. Nothing I could do about it. It was terribly frustrating to think of Riker walking around instead of thrashing against the duct tape. Homicidius interruptus. A soft moan and a gnashing of mental teeth came from the Dark Passenger, and I knew just how he felt, but there seemed to be very little I could do except pace back and forth. And even that wasn't very helpful. If I kept it up, I would wear a hole in the carpet and I would never get back my security deposit on the apartment. My instinct was to do something that would throw Dokes off the track, but he was no ordinary bloodhound. I could only think of one thing that might take the scent out of his quivering, eager snout. It was just barely possible that I could wear him down, play the waiting game, be relentlessly normal for so long that he would have to give it up and return to his real job of catching the truly horrible residents on the other side of our fair city. Why even now? They were out double parking, littering, and threatening to vote Democratic in the next election. How could he waste time on little old Dexter and his harmless hobby? All right then. I would be unsettlingly, stingingly ordinary until it made his teeth hurt. It might take weeks rather than days, but I would do it. I would live fully synthetic, the life I had created in order to appear human. And since humans are genetically ruled by sex, I would start with a visit to my girlfriend, Rita. It's an odd term, girlfriend, particularly for grown persons, and in practice, even an odder concept. Generally speaking, in adults, it described a woman, not a girl, who was willing to provide sex, not friendship. In fact, from what I observed, it was quite possible for one to actively dislike one's girlfriend, although of course, the true hatred is reserved for marriage. I had been unable to determine what women expect in return from a boyfriend, but apparently I had it as far as Rita was concerned. It certainly wasn't sex, which to me seemed as interesting as calculating foreign trade deficits. Luckily, Rita was also uninterested in sex, for the most part. She was the product of a disastrous early marriage to a man whose idea of a good time was to be out smoking crack and beating her. Later, he branched out into infecting her with several intriguing diseases. But when he battered the kids one night, Rita's marvelous country song loyalty ruptured, and she flung the swine out of her life and happily into prison. As a result of all this turmoil, she had been looking for a gentleman who might be interested in companionship and conversation, someone who did not need to indulge in the crude animal urges of base passion. A man, in other words, who would value her for her finer qualities and not her willingness to indulge in naked acrobatics, etc. Dexter. For almost 2 years, she had been my ideal disguise, a key ingredient, and in return, I had not beaten her. I had not infected her with anything, had not forced my animal lust on her, and she actually seemed to enjoy my company. And as a bonus, I had become quite fond of her children, Aster and Cody. Strange, perhaps, but nonetheless true, I assure you. If everyone else in the world were to mysteriously disappear, I would feel irritated about it only because there would be no one to make me donuts. But children are interesting to me. In fact, I like them. Rita's two kids had been through a traumatic early childhood, and maybe because I had to, I felt a special attachment to them, an interest that went beyond maintaining my disguise with Rita. Aside from the bonus of her children, Rita herself was quite presentable. She had short, neat, and blonde hair, a trim and athletic body. She seldom said things that were outright stupid. I could go into public with her. I could go into public with her, and know we looked like an appropriate matched pair, which was really the whole point. People even said we were attractive to people. Although I was never sure what that meant, I suppose Rita still found me attractive somehow. Although her track record with men didn't make that too flattering. Still, I was always nice to be around. It's always nice to be around somebody who thinks I am wonderful. It confirms my low opinion of people. I looked at the clock on my desk. 5:32. Within the next 15 minutes, Rita would be home from her job at the Fairchild Title Agency, where she did something very complicated involving fractions of percentage points. By the time I got to her house, she should be there. With a cheerful synthetic smile, I headed out the door, waved to Dokes, and drove over to Rita's modest South Miami house. The traffic wasn't too bad, which is to say that there were no fatal accidents or shootings, and in just under 20 minutes I parked my car in front of Rita's bungalow. Sergeant Dokes cruised past to the end of the street, and as I knocked on the front door, he parked across the way. The door swung open, and Rita peered out at me. "Oh," she said. "Dexter." "In person," I said. "I was in the neighborhood and wondered if you were home yet." "Well, I just walked in the door. I must look like a mess. Come on in. Would you like a beer?" Beer? What a thought. I never touched this stuff, and yet it was so amazingly normal. So perfectly visit the girlfriend after work, even though Dokes had to be impressed. It was just the right touch. "I would love a beer," and said, and I followed her into the relative cool of the living room. "Have a seat," she said. "I'm just going to freshen up a little." She smiled at me. "The kids are out back, but I'm sure they'll be all over you when they find out you're here." And she swished off down the hall, running, returning a moment later with a can of beer. "I'll be right back," she said, and went away to her bedroom at the back of the house. I sat on the sofa and looked at the beer in my hand. I am not a drinker, but really, drinking is not a recommended habit for predators. It slows reflexes, dulls the perceptions, and it's up the raveled sleeve of care, which always sounded to me like a very bad thing. But here I was, a demon on vacation, attempting the ultimate sacrifice by giving up my powers and becoming human. And so a beer was just the thing for dysphobic Dexter. Dipsop dis was just the thing for dipsobic Dexter. I took a sip. The taste was bitter and thin, and just as I would be if I had to keep the Dark Passenger buckled into the seat for very long. Still, I suppose beer is an acquired taste. I took another sip. I could feel it gargle all the way down and splash into my stomach. It occurred to me that with all this excitement and frustration of the day, I hadn't eaten lunch. But what the hell? It was just a light beer, or as the proudly proclaimed light beer. I suppose we could be very grateful that they haven't thought of a cuter way to spell beer. I took a big sip. It wasn't that bad when you get used to it. By golly, it really was relaxing. I, at any rate, felt more relaxed with each swig. Another refreshing sip. I couldn't remember that I had tasted it this good. I couldn't remember that it had tasted this good when I tried it in college. Of course, I was just a boy then, not the manly, mature, hard-working, upright citizen I was now. I tilted the can, but nothing came out. Well, somehow the can was empty, and yet I was still thirsty. Could this unpleasant situation really be tolerated? I thought not. Absolutely intolerable, in fact. I did not plan to tolerate it. I stood up and proceeded to the kitchen in a firm and unyielding manner. There were several more cans of light beer in the refrigerator, and I took one to the back of the couch. I sat, I opened the beer, I took a sip, much better. Damn that Dokes anyway. Maybe I should take him a beer. It might relax him, get him to loosen up the whole thing off. After all, we're all on the same side, aren't we? I sipped. Rita came back wearing a pair of denim shorts and a white tank top with a tiny satin bow at the neckline. I had to admit, she looked very nice. I could really pick a disguise. I could really pick a disguise. Well, she said, as she slid onto the couch next to me, it's nice to see you, out of the blue like this. It certainly must be, I said. She cocked her head to one side and looked at me funny. Did you have a hard day at work? An awful day, I said, and took a sip. Had to let a bad guy go. Very bad guy. Oh, she frowned. Couldn't you just... I wanted to. Just, I said, but I couldn't. I raised the beer can to her politics. I took a sip. Rita shook her head, and I still can get used to that idea. From the outside, it seems so cut and dried. You find the bad guy, you put him away, but politics? With what did he do? He helped to kill some kids, I said. Oh, she said, and looked shocked. My God, there must be something you can do. I smiled at her. By gum, she had seen it right away. What a gal. Didn't I say I could pick 'em? You have to put your finger right on it, I said, and I took her hand to look at my finger. There was something I can do, and very well, too. I patted her hand, spilling only a little bit of beer. I knew you'd understand. She looked confused, and she said, oh, what will you do? I took a sip. Why shouldn't I tell her? I could see she already got the idea. Why not? I opened my mouth, but before I could even whisper one syllable about the Dark Passenger or my harmless hobby, Cody and Aster came running into the room, stopped dead when they saw me, and stood looking for me to their mother. Hi, Dexter, Aster said. She nudged her brother. Hi, she said softly. Hi, he said softly. He was not a big talker. In fact, he never said much of anything. Poor kid. The whole thing with his father had really messed him up. Are you drunk? He asked me. It was a big speech for him. Cody, Rita said. I waved her off bravely and faced him. Drunk? I said. Me? He nodded. Yeah? Certainly not. I said firmly, giving him my best dignified frown. Possibly a little bit tipsy, but that's not the same thing as all. Oh, he said. His sister chimed in. Are you staying for dinner? Oh, I think I should probably be going, I said, but Rita surprisingly put her firm hand on my shoulder. You're not driving anywhere like this, she said. Like what? Tipsy, said Cody. I'm not tipsy, I said. You said you were, said Cody. I couldn't remember the last time I had heard him put 4 words in a row like that. I was very proud of him. You did, Aster added. You said you weren't drunk, you're just a little tipsy. I said that? They both nodded. Oh, well then, Rita chimed in, I guess you're staying for dinner? Well then, I guess I did. I am pretty sure I did, anyway. I do know that at some point I went to the refrigerator for a light beer and discovered they were all gone, and at some later point I was sitting on the couch again. The television was on and I was trying to figure out what the actors were saying and why an invisible crowd thought it was the most hilarious dialogue of all time. Rita slid into the couch next to me. The kids are in bed, she said. How do you feel? I feel wonderful, I said. If only I could figure out what's so funny. Rita put a hand on my shoulder. It really bothers you, doesn't it? Letting the bad guys go. Children. She moved closer and put her arm all the way around me, laying her head on my shoulder. You're such a good guy, Dexter. No, I'm not, I said, wondering why she would say something so very strange. Rita sat up and looked at me from my left eye to my right eye and back again. But you are. You know you are. She smiled and nestled her head back down onto my shoulder. I think it's nice that you came here to see me when you were feeling bad. I started to tell her that wasn't quite right, but then it occurred to me I had come here when I felt bad. True, it was only to bore Dokes into going away after all the terrible frustration of losing my playdate with Riker. But it had turned out to be a pretty good idea after all, hadn't it? Good old Rita. She was very warm and she smelled nice. Good old Rita, I said. I pulled her against me as tight as I could and leaned my cheek up against the top of her head. We sat that way for a few minutes and then Rita wiggled her feet and pulled me up by the hand. Come on, she said, let's get you to bed. Which we did. And when I had flopped down under the top sheet and she crawled in beside me, she was just so nice and smelled good and felt so warm and comfortable that, well, beer really is amazing stuff, isn't it?